All right, so good afternoon. My name is Dr. Amie Cohen. I am the Assistant Director with the Center for Excellence in Learning and Teaching here at Stony Brook. And I appreciate you taking the time today to log in and learn about assessment. We do have a small group, so feel free to just enter any questions you may have throughout the presentation in the chat. So I always like to start this presentation with just a brief quote about assessment and its importance for driving learning. Because whenever you give students an assessment task, it's embedded with the course content, right? So it means they're going to have to engage with that course content in some way. The way you choose to format and time the assessment can also be used strategically to facilitate learning. And then after students complete an assignment, right, the feedback that they're given ultimately will help to push that learning process forward. So as the assistant director in CELT, I really am responsible for promoting assessment at the course level, right? So there is a lot of assessment that might take place more at the program level, but my focus specifically is about that assessment that takes place in the classroom on the week-to-week or day-to-day basis. So learning objectives for this session. By the end, you should be able to identify why assessment is important to learning, articulate the different steps in the assessment process, which is cyclical, right? So it really doesn't have a beginning and an end. It should be ongoing. We're going to talk about some different types of assessment terminology and when to incorporate different types of assessment into your courses, when to select specific assessment strategies based on your learning objectives, and just in general, how you can use CELT services to continue the process of applying some of these assessment tools and techniques that we're going to start talking about today. It is an assessment fundamentals course, so this is kind of a basic foundation or starting point. I am available to Stony Brook faculty and staff to hold individual consultations and discuss how to incorporate some of these strategies into their courses. So our agenda for today, we're going to talk about the levels at which assessment occurs, why assessment is important, how the assessment cycle moves about, relations with course design and specifically course alignment, the difference between formative and summative assessment, and some tools that are common in the assessment process. So assessment ultimately should be aligned from the institutional level all the way down to an individual unit or lesson, right? So if it's a specific module in an online course or a specific class session that you're covering, right? Every institution will have some learning goals around what they want students to take away from completion of a degree. And then those learning outcomes become a little bit more specific based on the academic program, right? So whether it's an undergraduate program, a graduate program, what the specific academic discipline is. And the academic program goals ultimately are assessed within different required courses for a degree program, right? So assessment methods at the course level are often also assessing those learning outcomes for the academic program as a whole. And then assessment and learning at each individual lesson is ultimately contributing to that learning for any individual course. So why is assessment important? First and foremost, it guides instruction. Right? Assessment is a way to check in and see our students learning what we want them to learn. And if they aren't picking up the material at the pace we want them to, that would then provide intel for us to make changes on our teaching approach or our course design. It confirms whether students are following the concepts we're introducing and understanding the content. In some cases, we may need to reiterate some information. We may need to reteach certain units, make changes on the fly, as well as potentially refer students to additional support services, tutoring, supplemental instruction, things of that nature. It helps identify strengths and weaknesses both of individual students and of the course design and teaching approach. It can identify current gaps in knowledge or understanding. It also helps students self-regulate their own learning. So it gives them feedback on how they're doing and guidance on where they need to potentially work more, review more content. And ultimately, at the end of the course, we can determine if the learning outcomes have been achieved, and we can look at the data and analyze it to see if we are reaching the goals that we set for the class. So assessment can also be used to evaluate course and teaching effectiveness, and ultimately can gauge the impact of a specific course. But essentially, when you boil it down, we're really looking to answer a few different questions. Are we teaching what we think we're teaching? Are students learning what they're supposed to be learning? Is there a way to teach our subject better, whereas it would result in better learning? And do we have the data and the evidence to show that our courses and ultimately our programs are effective? So I just want to take a few moments to ask the group maybe to share in the chat what you find to be most challenging about assessing student learning, right? What do you find to be the challenge? Let's take a few moments and you can share a whole sentence, or you could just share a word or two. Okay, participation, right? That's an important one. And a lot of times participation is a part of that ongoing assessment process, right? To see if students are learning what we want them to learn. So if we have small group activities, in-class discussions or out-of-class discussions, right? Are we getting that engagement and then participation? And I see it also mentioned that engagement can be even more of a challenge in that online environment, particularly when it's asynchronous and you don't have that face-to-face time. But even if it is a synchronous online learning environment over Zoom, it can be difficult, even though in some ways there are additional tools, right? There are polls, there are chat features, but you can certainly have a lot of additional challenges with getting that engagement online. And yeah, you can certainly record participation through clickers, right? So doing online polling, I think traditionally they've been called clickers because students, used to have a specific device where they clicked in their responses. Many clicker software is now just, connected through an app that students would have on their own devices. So their phones, their tablets, or even their laptops. And certainly there can be a means to capture participation in those polls, right? So that can certainly help with recording. But I think meaningful participation is an interesting thought there, right? Because a student can just click a response, put something in response to a poll. But that won't necessarily mean it's meaningful if students aren't thinking about the material and processing in that way. And I see that already a link to clickers through the Division of Information Technology was posted in the chat, and that's a great resource to take a look at and leverage in your courses. All right, so we think about these different challenges. We're going to talk now about assessment as a cycle, and how you could potentially make it easier just by having well-defined goals and a structured course that aligns your outcomes with your assessment methods. Participation may be a challenge nonetheless, but if there is more of a clear alignment between the learning goals for the class, the objectives for the class, and the ways in which content is introduced and ultimately assessed, students may be more willing and able to see a clear path to participation. Also, improving the course regularly based on the data we're getting can show students that you are pivoting and are making changes based on their feedback and their participation, which is again going to encourage them to engage more. So when you think about, that first step in the assessment cycle, that's really having your goals for the course, right? What content do you wish to deliver to students? And ultimately, what do you want them to be able to know or do by the end of the class? And in order to have a good assessment plan for your course, you ultimately need to have your objectives written in measurable terms, right? It's impossible to know if a goal is met if there's no way to measure the outcome. The second step is really course alignment, right? That's the design process that makes sure your objectives for the class are matched up well with the assessment methods that you're using to see if students have met those objectives. And ultimately, are you also having course learning activities that are linked that will give them the information and the skills needed to succeed on the assessment tasks? And then, really just looking at the data collectively to see at different points in the semester and also at the end of the course what changes you may want to make. And when you're collecting data, that can be direct assessment of learning in the classroom, right? Looking at how students perform on the different assignments or exams or quizzes. But it can also be asking students for feedback on the approach you're taking the course, maybe like a midterm course evaluation to ask them how they're successfully learning or what they may be struggling with in the class. And that will then help you to kind of complete that feedback loop, right? To actually use the information and the assessment data to make changes either during a course or at the conclusion for the next time you teach the class. So I just want to spend a few moments zooming in a little bit on the course alignment piece. So I spoke before about getting students to engage and participate. If you have a well-aligned course where there's clear reasoning behind the assignments and assessment tasks you're giving, then students will be a little bit more willing or able to participate. So when you think about course design, you may be tempted to start first on how am I going to teach? What activities am I going to have in the class? What content am I going to have set up on my online modules? But from a backwards design perspective, you actually want to think first about the end, right? What do you want students to be able to achieve and know by the completion of the learning experience, right? So if we're talking about a course, then we're talking about what students will be able to do at the end of the semester or the term. But you can also think about this process for every individual lesson or unit, and then also at the larger programmatic level as well. Once you have your desired results in mind and your learning objectives listed, then what is acceptable evidence for students to be able to show that they've acquired the skills and knowledge that you are looking for? And from there, you plan the learning experiences and instruction to give them the tools that they need to successfully demonstrate their learning. So here's an example of how backwards design can work, right? So you start with that specific and measurable learning objective. you select an assessment method, and then you think about how you would introduce the concepts behind the learning, right? So your learning objective in this case is to have students be able to identify and apply the formal elements of art, right? So we're focusing there on the ability to recall, understand, and ultimately apply knowledge, specifically knowledge around the formal elements of art. And then the assessment method in this case is a specific project that involves photography, right? So a specific method of art or way of doing art, where students need to take photographs that demonstrate and apply each of those elements. And then you can think about what you would actually do in the course, how you would introduce the material, the content around what are those formal elements of art, provide some examples, right? So then students can have that foundational knowledge to go ahead and take their own photographs, demonstrating those concepts. I'm just seeing the question in the chat about clickers. So as of right now, the students do need to purchase clickers, right? It is a subscription where the cost is on the student. There are some online polling platforms that have free versions for smaller class sizes. Wouldn't necessarily be a good fit for large lectures. But I know also that there is a priority to look into new software options and ideally purchase one for the university that would take that onus off the students to pay for the clickers. So more to come on that. Hopefully there will be new software available to us by our next academic year. So when you think about assessment, there's two main types of assessment. There's what we call formative assessment. That is the assessment that goes on every day in the classroom or every week on the learning management system that really is just kind of a check-in on that day-to-day basis or week-to-week basis to see if students are digesting the material as we go along. It is also using assessment activities to have students practice and engage with the course material regularly. So the ultimate purpose of formative assessment is to facilitate learning and help us pivot live during a class or during a learning experience to make changes, to potentially go back and revisit a concept that maybe students didn't quite understand the first time around. Summative assessment is what takes place really after the conclusion of a learning experience. So it could be at the conclusion of a unit or a course or ultimately an entire semester or program. At that point, there's no new learning happening, right? It's really just a measure of, did students meet the objective for this learning experience? And a good course will include both of these assessment methods because the formative assessment is what will improve the experience for the current students, whereas the summative assessment can be taken into account to improve the course moving forward for future iterations. So I think the biggest takeaway here is that formative assessment is ultimately for learning. It's part of the process. It helps make learning happen. And it takes place throughout the entire course. And it helps an instructor identify where those gaps in knowledge are in order to improve learning. Formative assessments also tend to be low stakes assessments. So obviously, either they're going to be worth a very small percentage towards a final grade or potentially just participation based, right? So as long as a student is engaging in the material and submitting a response to a clicker question or participating in a role play activity, they're engaged and they're doing it, even if perhaps they don't necessarily get the most correct or advanced answer to a question. Summative assessment really is assessment of learning, right? Takes place at the end of an instructional period and is ultimately for information collection for us as instructors and educators to make changes moving forward, right? For our next cohort of students that may engage in the course. These assessments tend to be a little bit more higher stakes, tend to be more of your final projects, your final exams, things that would cover a larger quantity of content, right? So it's just some examples of formative and summative assessments. Obviously, these would look different depending on your discipline and how it fits within that. The formative assessments would be more weekly quizzes, in-class group activities, brief in-class reflections, low-stake weekly assignments, so potentially like participating in a discussion board on a regular basis for either an in-person or an online class, and clicker questions or class polls that might be part of that experience. Your summative assessments, those are your exams and your tests that are a little bit higher stakes. Your bigger projects, papers, presentations, or demonstrations, right? And again, those tend to take place towards the end of a learning experience. So whether that's a specific unit within the course or at the end of the course as a whole. So this next slide kind of gives you a little bit more information about some of the assessment terminology you may hear about. And I may have actually been using some of this jargon throughout the presentation. So I think it just helps to kind of go over the terms and have that basic understanding of what each of them are, right? So direct assessment, that's ultimately the assignments you give out in class where you ask students to demonstrate their knowledge and/or skills, right? So if their learning objective is being able to articulate findings of a research study to an audience, you may then assign a presentation, right, where a student needs to present on research findings, right? And so they're providing direct evidence where you can see the skills they have in that area. Indirect assessment, meanwhile, is really about students' perceptions and reflections on their learning, right? What about their educational environment and the teaching approach has helped them successfully learn? And where do they maybe still need to do some work or could still use more support? So this is where you would potentially have surveys, focus groups, interviews, right? You could add questions to a course evaluation, right? If there are specific aspects of your course that you want student feedback on. Then you may hear the term objective assessment. So both objective and subjective assessments are forms of direct assessment, right? You're asking students to demonstrate their knowledge and skills. But something that's objective, those are assessment questions that will have a right or a wrong answer. So it's pretty clear whether a student gets the points or doesn't get the points, right? This is, your classic multiple choice questions, true, false questions. Grading doesn't require judgment or expertise in an area, computer can grade it, or somebody with no knowledge but has an answer key can do that grading. Meanwhile, your subjective assessments are those that yield many possible responses and ultimately require judgment and expertise to score and assess, right? So I talked before about the example of a student giving a presentation of results of a research study, right? So in that case, how are you evaluating the learning, right? A lot of times to make a subjective assessment as objective as possible, you'll use rubrics, right? Where you have a description of really what would show exemplary learning, right? What would that exemplary presentation look like compared to maybe something that's satisfactory or needs improvement? But essentially things like essays, papers, projects, presentations, right? It's not really you got it right, you got it wrong, all points, no points. There's judgment involved. And often to make it as systematic as possible, particularly if it's a high stakes assessment. You'll want to use rubrics. You'll also hear the term traditional versus authentic assessment. So traditional assessments are really referring to the requirement for students to take tests, right? To be given a question and have to respond to it. And that could be, your objective multiple choice questions, but it can also be an essay exam or a short answer question. But really, you're asking students to demonstrate their knowledge by responding to questions. Whereas authentic assessment, which has really emerged over, or become a key term over the last decade or so, is really having students demonstrate their skills through the use of real life tasks, right? So having them, do simulations, do role plays, do projects, right? Presenting results of research, right? If you ultimately want to go into research, that's a real life task, right? You would present on your research at a conference, right? Compared to answering a multiple choice, exam on assessment method, or rather, I'm sorry, research methods with questions about validity and, the scientific method, et cetera. So those authentic methods, right, is more of that demonstration of skills related to real life tasks. So the next thing you need to consider when selecting assessment tasks for your courses is the rigor, right? And what level of knowledge do you want students to have with regards to the topic in your class? And sometimes an introductory course may really just start with, remembering information, being able to understand concepts, and potentially apply them at, a somewhat introductory level. As you move into advanced courses, certainly as you move into graduate level courses, the expectations and the learning outcomes are going to be more related to really being able to analyze information, explore relationships between concepts, evaluate and make judgments and critique work of others, right? So you think about peer review. That's something that's more at the professional academic level, but ultimately you're making judgments and analyzing the work of others, right? And that's something we want students, in some cases, particularly at the graduate level, to be able to learn to achieve that level of knowledge and skill. And then sort of at the top of your Bloom's taxonomy period is the ability to create one's own work, right? So we talked before about, being able to present on research, right? Are you just presenting the results of a research study that you read, or did you actually develop your own proposal and collect some data and actually carry it out? Obviously that's ultimately, what we're assessing potentially at the PhD level, right? When someone, gives their dissertation, that's their own study that they're presenting on. But within each course, depending on the level of rigor and depending on the point in the course, right? Maybe at the beginning, really, it is just focusing on understanding some of the content before building to some of these higher outcomes. And so as you create formative assessment activities and summative unit assessments, you want to think about what are the outcomes at this stage in the course versus at the end of the course, and how should I formulate my assessments accordingly. So when you're thinking about what your outcomes are for a class or for a given unit, you can kind of look at the verbs that you're using in your learning outcomes and classify the learning outcome according to Bloom's taxonomy, right? So if you're just asking for a student to recall, recognize, or state information, that's really just in the remember realm of learning. Whereas when you get a little bit more advanced, you're looking at things like diagnose, rate, revise, validate. You'll see that some of the assessment methods move from more simplistic objective methods to more complex, more subjective, and more authentic assessment methods, right? So, clicker questions you can use just to make sure students are retaining some of the information that you're providing. But you can also, provide some multiple choice and clicker questions really all the way up to the application level, where you provide an example and ask, what concept is this demonstrating? That type of thing. So this is not in any way an exhaustive list of every assessment method that is out there. These are examples and maybe can help you diversify the different assessment methods you use within your own course. I think that can also help with participation, right? So if it's the same types of assignments every time, you might have similar students participating in those activities. But if you change up the types of ways students have to demonstrate their learning, you may be able to capture more participation as well. So I'm going to, speak a little bit to quick tips on some assessment tools and assessment strategies that are very common, because I think, those traditional and objective methods, they still have their place, quizzes, exams, while they shouldn't be the only method that are being used in classes, they still certainly have a role and a place, particularly if you're looking to have students demonstrate that initial understanding or basic application of a concept. So just some quick tips, some best practices if you are going to be using the traditional exam. So multiple choice questions, in terms of cognitive load and student thinking, students tend to perform better when multiple choice questions are written in the form of a question rather than an incomplete sentence that then the answer finishes. So it could be the question getting at the same type of content, and the same student will do better responding to a question that, or I should say an item, a multiple choice exam item that is written in the form of a question. You also shouldn't contain any irrelevant material in that initial STEM or question portion of a multiple choice exam, because then again, you're also then assessing just reading comprehension and cognitive load through your exam, not necessarily the content and the learning objective you're looking for. Now, if you're trying to assess learning comprehension and cognitive load, then, that can be okay. But for the most part, that's not the goals of many of our courses. And so making that STEM of your multiple choice question as concise as possible and not including that distracting, irrelevant material is important for a quality question. Another thing that's important, you hear it indicates the desired response. Essentially, that means that a student who is well-versed and knowledgeable of a subject would be able to answer the question without looking at the choices, right? So there is a clearly desired response that a student would be able to respond to even without reading all of the choices. When you're including choices, you want them to be plausible, right? Rather than adding incorrect choice, which you may hear referred to as distractors, that is just completely unrealistic, right? Maybe it's a list of historical figures. If you include, a fictional character that students obviously know is not correct, there's no point in even including that choice, right? So you want to have plausible choices provided. The choices, like the question, should be clear, concise, not include any additional irrelevant material. And as a general best practice, again, sometimes there are questions that really call for it if you're trying to get at student understanding of, multiple characteristics of a specific concept, but try to minimize your use of all of the above or none of the above. Again, those don't necessarily get at assessing student knowledge on the topic you're looking for. It tends to correspond back more to reading comprehension and cognitive load instead. Short answer questions, they tend to be higher order questions, right, in terms of that Bloom's taxonomy pyramid. So you don't really need short answer questions for assessing recollection or understanding, but they're really a good tool for application. They should also have a clear, not misleading response, right? So when you read it, there might be different ways to word the answers, but there's something clear about what you're looking for. If something is indeed a short answer question, you should limit it to having no more than 5 elements, right? Meaning that if you're asking for too many things at once, it should be a separate question, right? So going back to, surveys, if you've ever filled out a survey and it seems like you're agreeing with a statement that is 2 different things at the same time, you don't know exactly how you're supposed to answer it, right? So really don't put too many elements into the short answer question because students will, again, probably not be able to address them all in one question. Now, short answer responses, even though there's a desired way to approach the question, there can be multiple correct ways of responding. So short answer questions fall into that subjective category, right? There's not necessarily one right answer. And so keep that in mind, that you would need people grading the material that have knowledge of the topic. New terms or new languages not used, right? So within your questions, you shouldn't be introducing new terminology that wasn't introduced in the course or in the readings or in the course content in some way. Now your essay questions, right? That's where you do have multiple components, but you do provide clear directions. Essay questions tend to be a little bit more focused on those higher order critical thinking skills. So there might be a comparing or contrasting or analyzing the relationship between 2 concepts. But there should still be a response for a student who has learned the material. There should be, kind of in their mind when they think about it, a direction that they know they should be going in. But again, like short answer, multiple possible accurate ways of approaching the response. And essay questions, shouldn't just be asking students to list factual pieces of information. It should be in written paragraph format, right? Shorter answer questions could be a list, but essay questions, there should be writing and integrating the information into a written piece. So another really important tool, if you're going to systematically assess learning in your classes, are rubrics, right? Because once we move beyond the rigor levels of just remembering and understanding, we're moving into more complex, more subjective assessment methods. And therefore, we need to provide some expectations to both our students and to ourselves for grading, or potentially our TAs if we have TAs assisting us through the grading process. In terms of rubrics, you may have heard that there are 2 types of rubrics. In some cases, there'll be other grading tools as well, like checklists, things of that nature. But rubrics primarily are either holistic or analytical. So your holistic rubric essentially lists the different levels of potential achievement and describes what it would look like. And if it's being used for grading, you could simply have a description of what an A paper would look like. And that description would include content development, organization of the paper, grammar and mechanics, use of proper citing. It would include all of those categories. And essentially, you just need to make that holistic judgment of which level the paper best fits into, right? So it could be the A, the B, the C, the D, depending on your grading scheme. If you wanted to instead make it more of a exemplary, satisfactory, developing type of approach, you could do that as well for each of your categories. But again, it's that holistic judgment where all of those different criteria are considered together and you're making that big picture judgment about where it falls. Analytic rubrics appear more in a table format and consider those categories separately, right? So the content or ideas presented may be rated on, a 3-point scale or a 4-point scale, whatever you choose to use as your rating scale, separately from the organization of the paper, which is a separate rating. And then you have another rating for the grammar and the spelling and the attention to detail, and a separate rating for whether proper MLA or APA formatting was used, right? And so that can allow you to be a little bit more detailed in your feedback. Holistic judgments can be a little bit more challenging because you might say, well, the ideas were great. It was well organized and well presented, but they did not use APA. They did not use MLA, so then it's like, okay, well, where do I put them on the holistic rubric? The analytical rubric allows you to rate those criteria separately. And provide a little bit more detailed feedback to students when they see their grades. Just some, kind of do's and don'ts around rubrics. Generally avoid negative labels for level of performance. So I think traditionally a lot of rubrics you've seen like, excellent to poor, right? I think ultimately to be more inclusive, to encourage growth, we want to avoid terms like poor or unacceptable. Use things that, kind of are more encouraging growth, like developing or even potentially needs improvement can be okay. And then when you think about your descriptions, be as specific as possible and make things observable or measurable whenever possible, right? So if one of your rubric criteria is about grammar and spelling, you could literally put, less than 2 grammatical errors throughout the entire paper could be the exemplary level, right? And the middle error, the, middle criteria could be, between 3 and 5 or something like that, right? You're giving it specific measurable numbers. Now, is that always possible? Not necessarily, right? Because there is always going to be some subjectivity in our ratings of subjective assignments. That's just the nature of the methods. But you can, where possible, be specific, observable, and measurable. You also want to use parallel language across the scale points. So it should be very obvious to a student where the difference is between the exemplary level on a rubric and the satisfactory level, right? What puts them that notch above? And it could be that it's the same statement, but the number of errors just changes, right? Or it could be that, something like the paper provides an effective solution to, the proposed problem versus, the paper provides an effective and creative solution, right? For the next level. Again, getting at what do you want the learning outcomes to be and what would be exemplary for demonstrating them. And then when you're creating rubrics, it can be very helpful to test the rubric on previous student work, right? So if you, have graded before without a rubric, consider some examples that you really kind of had that gut feeling of this is a really good paper. This student knew their stuff. And see, does the rubric actually align, right? Are they being recognized for that through the rubric criteria? And then also get feedback from both students and colleagues and make modifications as needed when you're using rubrics. So I just want to add a quick note here because this is an assessment presentation, and I think generative AI is really kind of the elephant in the room when we think about assessing learning these days, right? Because you talk about papers and essays and videos or presentations, and now there's technology out there that can create all of that, right? Um, but I think it's also important to think about how AI can help us as educators to make our assessment work more efficient as well, right? So it's not only a threat to, do we know students are, actually doing their own work, or are they cheating, or are they using these tools inappropriately? But also, how can we leverage it? Right? When you think about course design and coming up with specific measurable learning objectives, you can use generative AI as a tool. Will it give you a perfect final great learning objective that you can put right on your syllabus? Probably not. But it can give you a good starting point that will save time and make your work more efficient if you are, say, designing a new course. If you want to include more clicker questions in your presentation of content, or move from a midterm final exam to more frequent quizzes that are lower stakes, you may want additional multiple choice questions, right, on a quick basis. You can use AI to help you do that. Again, always be sure to review AI generated content for accuracy and bias, because that is a weakness. And then also data security is something you want to be mindful of. Stony Brook does have Microsoft Copilot, which is a secure version of Microsoft's generative AI platform. So if you have any concerns in that area, that would be your go-to in terms of using generative AI. If you have subjective assignments in your courses and you want to consider creating rubrics, again, it can give you a foundation upon which to start, and then you can polish it to make it really an effective tool for grading and assessment. Many platforms like Copilot will export, a rubric that it created right to Excel for you, so you can make easy edits appropriately. And then you can also think about incorporating AI into assignments and other, means of assessment. We do a lot of peer evaluation. Students can use AI as a peer evaluator, right? They can critique AI as a source of information, right? There's a lot of information out there, and there's a lot of ways that we can leverage generative AI's capabilities to enhance our assessment strategies, rather than kind of getting bogged down with the concern of, academic dishonesty. That being said, we do have some upcoming generative AI workshops that focus on how we can redesign our assessments in response to generative AI, and also how we can use generative AI for ourselves to make some of the administrative work around teaching and learning a little bit more efficient and effective in terms of using our time for some of these tasks. So key takeaways really from today's presentation: assessment is important because it ultimately guides your instruction from week to week during a course, as well as each time you offer that course. Always, when you're designing your assessments and your learning activities, think first about what your learning objectives are. What do you want the outcome to be for students? What do you want them to be able to know or to do? And you should incorporate both formative and summative assessments in your course. And the rigor should be varied, right? So maybe even though you want students to be able to apply the knowledge or evaluate work in a certain area, by the end of a course, at the beginning, you may just want to be checking for that understanding to make sure they're building towards that. And I also strongly encourage you to use other CELT services in addition to some of the other workshops that I'm going to pull up on the next slide. I am happy to work with individual faculty, instructional staff on designing assessments for their courses, their workshops, their learning experiences. So some upcoming sessions, I think, that relate very closely to what we've been talking about today. We have an artificial intelligence panel discussion specifically on writing an AI in college. So you can hear both from students and from faculty on their perceptions about that. We also have our two generative AI in higher education workshops. One is a deep dive into assessment redesign. So where might we want to make tweaks to our assignments in our courses to account for the fact that generative AI might be a tool or might be a way for students to bypass learning, and instead think about how it can help facilitate it. We also have a more in-depth workshop on rubrics, on how to build them, to create them, and ultimately to use them. That will be on October 9th. And then our final AI workshop is how can AI make your life as a professor easier? And we'll be going over ways to use AI to help you in things like course design, writing learning objectives, developing exam questions, things of that nature. So again, encourage you to immerse yourself in more of what CELT has to offer, to really strive for excellence in learning and teaching. So that being said, that's the conclusion of the content I have for today. So please share any questions. There's also a QR code to our feedback survey, right? I am the point person for assessment in our office, not just to help others with assessment, but also to assess the workshops that we offer. So any feedback you can provide is greatly appreciated. If you have any questions, you can go ahead and put them in the chat. All right. I don't see any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.